You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Greetings, everyone. Coach Jen here, and thanks for tuning in to Horse Tip Daily, episode 1632. This time, we are taking a deep dive into feeding broodmares and young stock. And I'm so happy to welcome to the show Kristyn Sturken. She's the Equine Product Manager at Sentinel Horse Nutrition. Welcome to the show, Kristyn.
Thanks very much. Excited to be here.
This is going to be so much fun. Every time I talk to you guys over there at Sentinel Horse Nutrition, I have some kind of a light bulb moment. Last month, Dr. Rob was on, and we were chit-chatting and talking about Sentinel Horse Nutrition's extruded feed products. And there were several points I went, oh my gosh, I never even thought about it that way. So I fully anticipate that happening again today. So in the process of creating a extruded pellet, what happens to it that causes it to be a superior way for your horse to get actual nutrition into his body? What happens?
That's a great question. And I would start with by saying at Sentinel, we really try to say extruded is extruded and pellet is a pellet, and don't kind of latch on to extruded pellets because it's extruded versus pelleted. There are some similarities in the process, but extruded really means we can take any combination of ingredients, might be similar to what we put in a pellet, but all those ingredients are ground up, they're mixed, and then what we call conditioned or cooked. And we cook them using heat, steam, and high pressure. And we then force them through what we call a die, or a little cylindrical thing, and that's how we get the round shape. With extruded versus pelleted, we cook them to a much higher temperature. So that's how we get the ultimate light and airy nugget. So we put that kind of mix or blend through the die, and it subsequently expands upon the rapid cooling that follows, and it kind of pops into this very low density nugget versus if we compared it to a pellet, it's a much more dense looking pellet. If we broke apart a pellet, it would be very tight and very dense, whereas if you broke apart an extruded nugget, it would be very light and airy and very porous. So it's really that pressure and that high temperature that's different compared to a pellet, and we get a lot of nutritional benefits with that.
So cooking the ingredients with steam and heat actually improves the ability for the horse to gain nutrition from that nugget?
Yes. So the high temperature, ultimately it improves starch and protein digestibility and utilization of those nutrients, because the temperature starts to, what we like to say is like pre-digest the starch and the protein in that feed, because it starts to break apart and break down those molecules, those bonds, before the horse even takes a bite. So they're much more readily available as the digestion process starts. And where the horse benefits from that is we get that starch, that protein, those vitamins and minerals digested where they're ideally digested, in the foregut, in the stomach and the small intestine, before it reaches the hindgut. Because one thing you certainly don't want to get much of to the hindgut is, some of the starch and the sugar. So we can really help prevent, gas type colics that way because of that cooking.
So cooked food is better. There we go.
Food is better.
Cooked food is better. And as we record this little interview, it is rolling well into springtime now. So lots of folks are thinking about broodmares and baby horses. When you're feeding your broodmare, it's common practice to make sure that her condition, her body condition, her weight is appropriate as she moves into foaling, because once she foals, she uses up an enormous amount of calories, keeping her own condition and as well as keeping her foal's condition. Are there things that extruded nuggets can help with for broodmares?
I like to recommend an extruded feed in many different situations, but a broodmare, as you said, most importantly, keep their body condition at a good score. We don't want them to be too heavy. We don't want them to be too thin, especially as they approach foaling. So what's nice about the Extruded product line is there are a lot of options. So if you have a more easy keeping, broodmare, there's some lower fat, or we even have an extruded ration balancer type product that, as long as that mare is in good body condition and getting the protein, the vitamins, minerals that she needs, she doesn't need a lot of feed necessarily early on in the pregnancy. And then as she progresses, what's nice about extruded feed is it's very nutrient dense. So for some of those mares that maybe become a little bit harder keepers, we can pack a lot of nutrition per pound. We have a lot of offerings with higher fat, which means higher calories per pound. So ultimately that mare doesn't have to potentially use or need as much feed. But there's a lot of different options for the brood mares and then on into lactation.
So if you have a mare who, we're going to call her an average keeper, by making sure her body condition is appropriate from beginning to end until right up and through foaling, does that influence the foal in any way? Like if you have a broodmare that's all the way through, she's a 3.75 on the Heineke scale instead of a 5.1. Does that influence the foal statistically, that if the mare is underweight or is lacking nutrition?
It will. I mean, if she doesn't have enough energy or calories to maintain her own body weight, that is going to affect the foal size, the foal, weight when she does foal. And also, if she's lacking in energy, she's potentially lacking in protein, vitamins, and minerals as well, which, I can't probably stress enough. The minerals would be at the top of the list, but along with that, protein and vitamins, because the biggest part of foal growth is happening in that last trimester. So the foal is growing rapidly. They need those nutrients to develop properly. So yes, absolutely, having poor or on the poorer side mare nutrition is going to potentially affect the foal size, strength, development. So, ultra critical. That's when the critical time is, that last 3 months of gestation. And then of course, into lactation, we prefer that mare to be, probably a little bit on the heavier side, because she's going to just use a tremendous amount of energy. But then she needs to pass the vitamins, the protein, the minerals onto the foal through that milk.
That's right. And before we move on to foals, the cute part of this whole program, you mentioned that you have ration balancers as well as high calorie products that are appropriate for brood mares.
Yes.
Because there are brood mares at both ends of the spectrum. I've come across some brood mares that seem to say chunky on air regardless of how many babies they've got. What would be one or two of the Sentinel Horse Nutrition extruded products that you would typically recommend for brood mares?
A little bit depends on the quality of their forage too. So, if they're getting a moderate to good quality hay and or pasture, we have a product called Sentinel Grow and Excel, which is, 14% protein, it's 10% fat. So this would be a little bit more for that harder keeping horse. The easier keeper, we have a product called Sentinel Simply Light, which that's our extruded ration balancer. So it's typically, if the mare only needs 2 to 3 pounds of feed a day, that would be the one that I would kind of lean towards if you have that more easy keeper. Now, as the mare transitions closer to foaling, that would be potentially where we're making a recommendation to increase the protein a little bit, increase maybe the fat or the calories a little bit to go into foaling. We also have a high fat supplement too, if you really have that mare that you're having a lot of trouble keeping weight on.
There you go. And then springtime rolls around. It's foaling time, mare foals. At what point do foals start to require, because obviously very early on they're curious about foods. They taste test everything, even things they shouldn't. At what point do they require hard feeds Sentinel Horse Nutrition Extruded nuggets, for example. And where do I need to go with that? Because I know you can obviously underfeed a young horse, a foal or weanling, but you can overfeed them too.
Typically, depending on the horse, there's a range. We go by body weight and kind of make a reference of a range, pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. As you hit that 4 to 6 months old up to a year, they require a little bit more pounds per 100 pounds of body weight, and that adjusts up, and then it'll start to come down as they get older.
So for the Sentinel Horse Nutrition line of products, are there products that are designed specifically for that? We're going to take an arbitrary age group, 4 months to 1 year age group. Are there certain products that are formulated that are particularly advantageous for that age group?
We have two primary products, I would say, that are appropriate for that age group, along with the mare while she's lactating. So that is the Sentinel Safe Start and the Sentinel Grow and Excel. The big really difference between the two is protein. One's a 14%, one's a 16%. I typically lean towards the 16% for the Safe Start for those, young sucklings, weanlings up into a year. And then unless they're on, really 100% alfalfa hay along with that, I might lean a little bit more towards the Sentinel Grow and Excel because you're getting a lot of protein out of that hay as well. So I try to base the program, start with forage first. Of course, when they're suckling and weanlings, they're not going to be eating necessarily a lot of forage yet. So I would lean towards that Safe Start. But, let your hay and your forage help you determine what that young growing foal needs to. The same for the mare. Like if the mare, I typically would have the mare on either Safe Start or Grow and Excel. I use Grow and Excel if the mare is on, heavy alfalfa.
Got it. Now, for someone who wants to either change from their current feed to a Sentinel Horse Nutrition extruded product, what is best practices for changing those hard feeds?
Great question. So no matter what change you're doing, we recommend taking a week to 10 days to make that transition. Take longer if you know that you have a super picky or finicky horse. If you know that right off the bat, just say it's going to take me 2 weeks to switch over. But typically we would recommend a quarter of the new feed to 3/4 of the current or old feed for 2 or 3 days, 50-50 for 2 or 3 days, and then 3/4 of the new to 1/4 of the old for 2 to 3 days. And that gets you within that, week to up to 2 week time period. It's important to do that every single time. If you're going from, and the same for if you're going from that ration balancer, so that low feeding rate product to the higher feeding rate product, I would make the transition from one feed to the next slow, and then also slowly increase their grain because you may need more as you're going, towards the end of gestation and into lactation. So don't just go from, I'm feeding 3 pounds a day and I'm just going to feed 6 pounds a day. Make that change gradual too over time. And I also caution people if they're changing hay. I know we're not necessarily talking about changing hay, but even drastic hay changes, like, something that's super high in grass hay going to a, more grass legume or grass alfalfa mix to an alfalfa mix, you should also make that change slowly.
And the elephant in the room, of course, is a traditional pelleted feed versus an extruded nugget feed, because most of us, let's admit it, own up everybody, we feed our horses by volume, not by weight like we're supposed to. What is your advice for making sure when you switch, you're indeed switching like for like, in that the scoop is not going to weigh the same between the two?
I'm so glad you asked me this. We want everybody to weigh their feed. So what is very unique about extruded feed is that it is, we said earlier, much less dense. So if I took everybody knows a quart. So a quart of extruded feed weighs 0.85 pounds. A quart of a pellet, traditional pellet, weighs about 1.3 to 1.4 pounds. So ultra important to weigh your feed. I always recommend somebody that's going from a pellet to an extruded is know how many pounds you're feeding and then feed the same pounds, not the same scoops or the same volume, the same pounds. So that's super important. The other thing I always tell people is if you're going from a pellet, or even if I said a textured feed to an extruded, you might notice that your horse just takes a little bit longer to chew this feed. That's a great thing. It's healthier for the horse. It's a little bit larger in their mouth. It feels a little bit different. So till they get used to it, it might look like they're, just mouthing it a little bit, but they'll ultimately eat it a little bit slower, and that is great for reduced risk of digestive upset, reduced risk of choke, things like that, because it virtually, as soon as it hits the horse's saliva, it starts to dissolve and break down. So just some things to look for when you're making the switch.
There we go. And very, very important. And like you said, extruded versus pelleted versus textured. And there can be a significant difference in the weight per quart. So even if all you do is weigh it once, just that's important. Yes, it's absolutely important. And if you want to learn more about all of the great products from Sentinel Horse Nutrition, you can go to feedsentinel.com/podcast. And there's tons and tons of information about the various products, how to feed them properly, what type of horse and lifestyle each product is designed for. And thanks again for stopping by the show, Kristyn.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, there you have it. Horse Radio Network has thousands of engaging podcasts for horse people, and you can have them sent right to your phone. Just subscribe via your favorite podcast player. This is Coach Jen, and I will be back again soon with another tip. Until then, go ride your horse. The Horse Radio Network and the Horse Radio Network hosts are not responsible for statements made by guests on the Horse Tip Daily. Please use your own judgment when listening to the tips on this show.